Commander Sarah Chen stared at the holographic display, showing Earth's orbital defenses crumbling like paper in a storm. The Zephyrian fleet hung in space like a collection of crystalline daggers, each ship pulsing with an energy that made human technology look like children's toys. 3 months of war had taught humanity one harsh lesson. They were completely outmatched. "Ma'am, incoming transmission from Fleet Command," Lieutenant Rodriguez called from his station, his voice carrying the weight of defeat that had settled over the bridge like a thick fog. Sarah nodded, straightening her uniform despite knowing it might be one of the last times she wore it with any authority. Admiral Morrison's weathered face appeared on the main screen, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and the burden of command during humanity's darkest hour. "Commander Chen," Morrison began, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I'm sure you've seen the tactical reports. Luna Base fell an hour ago. Mars Colony has gone dark. The Zephyrians have agreed to accept our surrender, but they have specific requirements." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The Zephyrians were unlike any species humanity had encountered in their brief venture into galactic politics. Tall, elegant beings with skin that shifted between silver and blue depending on their emotional state, they communicated through a complex system of harmonic frequencies that human translators struggled to interpret accurately. "What kind of requirements, sir?" Morrison's expression grew even more grim. "They want a single human representative to come aboard their flagship and formally surrender not just our military, but our entire homeworld. Complete capitulation. They're calling it a ceremony of final submission." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not just military surrender, but giving up Earth itself. The implications were staggering. Every human colony, every settlement, every person would become subject to Zephyrian rule. "Sir, surely there must be some room for negotiation?" "There isn't." Morrison cut her off gently but firmly. "They've been very clear. One representative, total surrender, or they'll simply take what they want by force, and humanity ceases to exist as anything more than a footnote in galactic history." Sarah looked around her bridge crew. These people had served with distinction throughout the war, never wavering even as the situation became increasingly hopeless. Young Rodriguez at communications, barely 25 and brilliant with languages. Chief Engineer Patel, who had kept their aging cruiser running through impossible odds. Weapons Officer Kim, whose tactical innovations had bought them precious time in a dozen battles. "Why me, Admiral?" Morrison almost smiled. "Because you're the only senior officer who's had extended contact with non-human species. Your diplomatic training before the war. Your experience with the Andromedan trade negotiations 3 years ago. And frankly, because you're expendable enough that losing you won't cripple our remaining command structure, but experienced enough that the Zephyrians will take you seriously." Sarah understood the cold logic behind the decision, even as it stung. She was qualified, but not irreplaceable. Experienced, but not critical to any ongoing operations that Earth might somehow maintain after surrender. "When do I leave?" "Immediately. They're sending a transport. Commander, I want you to understand something." Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "This isn't just about preserving human lives, though that's important. If there's any chance, any possibility at all of maintaining some shred of human autonomy, some hope for our species' future, you need to find it in that meeting." The transmission ended, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the weight of representing every human being alive. She turned to her crew, seeing the mix of respect, fear, and desperate hope in their eyes. "Rodriguez, prep my personal effects. Include the cultural exchange materials from the Andromedan mission. Everything we learned about non-human communication protocols." "Yes, ma'am." "Should I include the linguistic analysis software?" "Everything. If I'm going to surrender our world, I'm going to do it with every tool we have." Sarah paused, looking out at the stars that might soon belong entirely to an alien species. And who knows? Maybe there's something we've missed. The Zephyrian transport arrived within 2 hours, a vessel that looked more like a living creature than a machine. Its hull rippled with bioluminescent patterns, and it moved through space with an organic grace that human ships could never match. As Sarah's shuttle approached the docking bay, she could see through the transparent sections of the alien ship's interior. The Zephyrians moved within like dancers in a three-dimensional ballet, their bodies flowing from surface to surface in the low-gravity environment. The docking process was surprisingly gentle. Sarah had expected the cold efficiency of conquerors, but instead found herself greeted by what could only be described as ceremony. The docking bay was filled with Zephyrians arranged in complex geometric patterns, their skin shifting through a spectrum of colors that her briefing materials suggested indicated formal respect. A single Zephyrian approached her as she stepped off the shuttle. This one was taller than the others, with additional ridge structures along its elongated skull and skin that seemed to hold more stability in its color patterns. The translation device around Sarah's neck crackled to life. "I am High Resonant Kethvar, speaker for the collective voice of Zephyr. You are the human who will perform the final submission ceremony." Sarah straightened, calling on every bit of military bearing she possessed. "I am Commander Sarah Chen, representing the government and people of Earth and all human colonies. I am here to discuss the terms of surrender." Kethvar's skin shifted to what Sarah's briefing materials indicated was surprise, with undertones of something that might have been amusement. "There are no terms to discuss, human. The ceremony is a formality to acknowledge what has already been decided. Your species has demonstrated its inability to participate in galactic civilization through peaceful means." "Then why require a ceremony at all?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious despite the circumstances. "If the outcome is predetermined, why not simply proceed with occupation?" The Zephyrian's coloration shifted again, this time to patterns Sarah didn't recognize from her briefing materials. The translation device seemed to struggle before finally producing words. "The collective voice requires proper acknowledgement of transition. Your species must formally recognize its new status. It is the way of civilized conquest." Sarah nodded slowly, filing away the information. The Zephyrians clearly operated under cultural rules that seemed almost ritualistic. Perhaps there was room for maneuvering within those rules, if she could understand them better. "I understand. When will the ceremony take place?" "When you have been properly prepared. The submission ceremony requires specific protocols. You must be instructed in the correct responses, the proper positioning, the appropriate acknowledgments. It would be unseemly to conduct such an important transition incorrectly." Kethvar gestured toward a corridor that pulsed with soft light. "You will be given quarters suitable to your species' needs. Preparation will begin shortly." As Sarah followed the Zephyrian through corridors that seemed to shift and flow around them, she noticed something important. The aliens weren't treating her as a prisoner or a defeated enemy. There was a formal respect in their movements, an almost ceremonial deference that suggested the surrender ritual held genuine significance in their culture. Her quarters were surprisingly comfortable, clearly designed with human needs in mind. The environmental controls were already set to Earth-normal parameters, and there was even what appeared to be human food waiting for her. Either the Zephyrians were remarkably thorough in their intelligence gathering, or they had more experience with human captives than anyone had realized. Sarah activated her personal datapad and began reviewing everything she knew about Zephyrian culture and communication. The linguistic analysis software Rodriguez had included started processing the conversation she'd recorded, looking for patterns and nuances that the real-time translator might have missed. What she found was intriguing. The Zephyrian language operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The base communication layer that the translator was picking up was only part of the message. There were harmonic undertones, color pattern shifts, and even what appeared to be chemical pheromone components that carried additional meaning. More importantly, the software was detecting inconsistencies in Kethvar's statements. The harmonic patterns suggested uncertainty or even reluctance when discussing the surrender ceremony. The color patterns indicated complex emotions that didn't match the confident dominance the words expressed. Sarah leaned back in the alien chair, her mind racing. What if the Zephyrians weren't as confident in their victory as they appeared? What if this ceremony was more important to them than simple ritual acknowledgement? What if they needed something from humanity that they weren't getting through simple conquest? A soft chime indicated someone approaching her quarters. Sarah quickly stored her datapad as Kethvar entered, accompanied by two other Zephyrians whose skin patterns were noticeably different from any she'd seen before. Commander Chen, these are the ceremony instructors. They will teach you the proper protocols for the submission ceremony. The two instructors approached with movements that seemed almost hesitant. Their skin showed colors Sarah's software had flagged as indicating anxiety or uncertainty. One of them spoke, its voice carrying harmonic patterns that made the translator work harder than usual. Human Chen, we must explain the requirements of the final submission ceremony. You will formally surrender not only military forces but claim to territorial rights, sovereign governance, and species autonomy. Do you understand these concepts as they apply to your species? Sarah paused, recognizing an opportunity. I understand the concepts, but I need to be certain that my responses will be properly understood by your collective voice. Human communication is apparently much simpler than Zephyrian, and I want to avoid any misunderstandings that might invalidate the ceremony. The instructors exchanged what could only be described as nervous glances, their skin patterns shifting rapidly. The second instructor spoke. What kind of misunderstandings concern you? Well, for example, when I surrender territorial rights, does that include territories that humans don't currently occupy but have legitimate claims to? If I incorrectly surrender unclaimed territories, would that invalidate the ceremony? And how do I properly acknowledge the transfer of species autonomy if I don't fully understand what that means in Zephyrian law? The silence that followed was profound. The instructor's skin patterns cycled through what Sarah's software identified as confusion, concern, and something that might have been panic. Finally, the first instructor spoke. These are complex questions. The ceremony requires proper understanding of all transferred rights and territories. Perhaps we should consult with legal harmonizers before proceeding. Kethvar, who had been observing silently, stepped forward. His skin patterns showed clear agitation. The ceremony was to be performed tomorrow. The collective voice expects completion of the transition protocol. But Speaker, the second instructor replied, if the human performs the ceremony incorrectly due to misunderstanding, the legal implications could be severe. Improper transfer protocols have caused significant problems in previous conquests. Sarah maintained her expression of concerned confusion while internally celebrating. She'd found the crack in their armor. The Zephyrians were operating under strict legal and ceremonial requirements that apparently had the potential to backfire if not performed correctly. Perhaps, Sarah said carefully, it would be helpful if I could review the exact territorial and sovereignty claims that I'll be surrendering, just to make sure I understand the full scope. I wouldn't want to accidentally exclude something important. The instructors looked at each other with what was unmistakably panic. Their skin patterns were cycling through colors that Sarah's software couldn't even identify. Kethvar's coloration shifted to what appeared to be resigned frustration. We will need to convene a legal harmonizer conclave. The ceremony will be delayed until proper documentation can be prepared. As the Zephyrians left her quarters, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She'd bought time, but more importantly, she'd discovered that the aliens were bound by their own bureaucratic and legal requirements. If she could understand those requirements better, she might find a way to turn humanity's surrender into something resembling negotiation. She activated her datapad again, this time focusing on analyzing every word, tone, and pattern from the conversation. Somewhere in the complex web of Zephyrian law and ceremony, there had to be an opportunity for humanity to salvage something from defeat. The question was whether she could find it before the collective voice lost patience with their own procedures. Sarah spent the next 18 hours immersed in the most intensive crash course in alien jurisprudence that any human had ever attempted. The legal harmonizer conclave had provided her with access to something called the Territorial Transfer Protocols Database, apparently a standard resource for conquered species to understand their new legal status. What they hadn't anticipated was that a human would actually try to comprehend the entire system. The database was a maze of interconnected legal precedents, ceremonial requirements, and bureaucratic procedures that had accumulated over thousands of years of Zephyrian expansion. Each conquest had added new layers of complexity, new edge cases, and new potential pitfalls. Sarah's linguistic analysis software was working overtime, cross-referencing harmonic patterns with legal terminology, while she struggled to understand concepts that had no human equivalent. The breakthrough came when she discovered the concept of territorial inheritance variance. According to Zephyrian law, if a species surrendered territories that they didn't actually control or inhabit, but had legitimate ancestral or legal claims to, those territories became subject to special administrative review. The surrendering species could maintain certain rights pending resolution of the inheritance status. More intriguingly, she found references to compensatory territorial adjustment. If a surrendering species gave up territories that were later found to be more valuable than initially assessed, or if the surrender process was found to be procedurally flawed, the collective voice was required to provide territorial compensation to maintain legal balance. Sarah was deep in a particularly complex subsection about multi-environment territorial rights when her door chimed again. This time, a group of 5 Zephyrians entered, their skin patterns indicating what her software identified as high-level stress and urgent concern. The leader, whose cranial ridges were even more elaborate than Kethvar's, spoke with harmonics that made her translator work harder than ever before. "I am Chief Legal Harmonizer Vethnal. We have discovered significant complications with your species' territorial surrender requirements." Sarah looked up from her datapad, trying to appear confused rather than pleased. "What kind of complications?" "Your species appears to have legal claims to territories that are not properly documented in our initial conquest assessment. The ceremony cannot proceed until these claims are properly cataloged and evaluated." "I see. What kind of claims are we talking about?" Vethnal's skin shifted to colors that suggested extreme discomfort. "According to our preliminary analysis, humans have established territorial markers on numerous celestial bodies throughout multiple star systems. However, many of these territories are not inhabited or actively controlled." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Well, yes. We have research stations, mineral claims, navigation beacons, communication relays, the usual territorial infrastructure. Some are automated, some are permanently staffed, some are seasonal. Is there a problem with that?" The legal harmonizer's response came in rapid bursts of color and sound that overwhelmed the translator temporarily. When it finally resolved into words, Sarah had to struggle to keep her expression neutral. "The problem, Human Chen, is that your species appears to have territorial claims spanning 17 star systems, including 4 planets that are currently unoccupied but legally designated as future colonial sites under human law. Additionally, you have established territorial markers in 3 systems that we have not yet surveyed for conquest potential." Sarah blinked. I hadn't realized the scope was so extensive. Will that affect the surrender ceremony? Catastrophically. Vethanol's skin was now cycling through colors so rapidly it looked like a broken light display. Under collective voice law, all territorial claims must be properly transferred. But many of your claims are in systems we do not currently control or have legal jurisdiction over. We cannot accept surrender of territories we cannot legally possess. Another Zephyrian, one whose pattern suggested it was a subordinate legal expert, stepped forward. Chief Harmonizer, there is an additional complication. Humans appear to have established what they call scientific research reserves on several worlds. These reserves are claimed but deliberately unpopulated to preserve them for future study. How many worlds? Vethanol asked. Preliminary count suggests 43. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the subtle harmonics of the ship's systems. Vethanol's skin had gone completely white, which according to her software was the Zephyrian equivalent of a computer blue screen. 43 reserve worlds? Chief Harmonizer, Sarah said carefully, is there a problem with reserve territories? I mean, I assumed that when I surrendered human territorial claims, that would include reserve holdings. Isn't that standard? No! The response came from all 5 Zephyrians simultaneously, their combined harmonics creating a chord that made Sarah's teeth ache. Reserve territories require special legal evaluation. The surrendering species maintains custodial rights until the conquering power can demonstrate proper environmental stewardship protocols. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized the implications. Environmental stewardship protocols? The conquering power must prove they can maintain the territorial environment according to the original species preservation standards. For uninhabited reserve worlds, this requires extensive environmental assessment and legal review. How extensive? Vethanol's patterns had shifted to what Sarah recognized as barely controlled panic. The standard review period for environmental custodial transfer is 50 to 75 years. For 43 worlds, the administrative burden would be unprecedented. One of the subordinate harmonizers spoke up. Chief Harmonizer, we have an additional problem. Human territorial law appears to designate an entire planet as an ocean world research reserve. According to their filing, it's intended for study of aquatic ecosystem development and is specifically protected against any territorial modification or settlement. Which planet? Kepler 438b. It's a water world in a system we had identified for future expansion. According to human territorial claims, it's been designated a permanent research reserve under something called the Aquatic Ecosystem Preservation Protocol. Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral while her mind raced. She remembered Kepler 438b from the astronomical surveys. It was an ocean world about twice Earth's size, with perfect conditions for human habitation if they could develop underwater cities or floating platforms. The research designation had been purely theoretical. Humanity had never actually visited the planet, much less established any kind of research presence there. But apparently, in the labyrinthine complexity of Zephyrian conquest law, theoretical territorial claims carried the same legal weight as actual occupation. Is there a problem with the ocean world designation? Sarah asked innocently. Ocean worlds require specialized environmental assessment protocols, Vethanol explained, his patterns now showing what could only be described as existential dread. The evaluation process requires aquatic environment specialists, marine ecosystem experts, and oceanic preservation legally binding agreements. We do not have these capabilities. What does that mean for the surrender ceremony? It means, said another harmonizer, that we cannot legally accept surrender of the ocean world until we develop the proper administrative infrastructure. Under territorial inheritance law, the custodial species maintains primary rights to reserve worlds until proper transfer protocols can be completed. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. So humanity would retain custodial rights to the ocean world? All 43 reserve worlds, Vethnal corrected miserably, including primary administrative rights to any reserve worlds that the collective voice cannot properly evaluate within the standard review period. And if you can't evaluate them, then territorial rights revert to the custodial species under the Abandoned Territorial Acquisition Protocol. Sarah stared at the assembled legal experts, hardly believing what she was hearing. Humanity had apparently, through nothing more than bureaucratic accident and overly thorough territorial filing, created a legal nightmare for their conquerors. Chief Harmonizer, perhaps I'm misunderstanding something. What exactly happens to the rest of the surrender ceremony? I mean, we still need to formally transfer the inhabited territories and the military surrender. Vethnal's skin patterns had settled into what her software identified as resigned defeat. The ceremony will need to be restructured into a partial territorial transfer with reserved rights provisions. It is a significantly more complex procedure. How complex? Instead of a simple surrender ceremony, we will need to conduct formal territorial negotiations to determine which rights are being transferred and which are being retained under custodial provisions. The process typically requires multiple sessions over an extended period. How extended? The shortest partial territorial transfer negotiation in collective voice history lasted 14 months. Sarah managed to maintain her composure while internally celebrating. Not only had she bought humanity significant time, but she'd accidentally discovered that their random territorial claims had legal standing that the Zephyrians couldn't simply ignore. I understand. When would these negotiations begin? Immediately. However, we will need to bring in additional legal specialists, environmental assessment teams, and territorial evaluation experts. The process cannot proceed without proper representation for all territorial categories. Of course. I want to make sure everything is done correctly. As the legal harmonizers filed out of her quarters, Sarah caught a fragment of their conversation that the translator almost missed. They were discussing something about impossible human territorial complexity and recommending alternative resolution protocols to the collective voice. Sarah activated her datapad again, this time with a very different purpose. She began composing a detailed analysis of everything she'd learned, along with a list of questions about territorial law that she planned to ask in the upcoming negotiations. If the Zephyrians thought human territorial claims were complex now, they hadn't seen anything yet. Sarah was just getting started. The next morning brought a visit from Kethvar, whose skin patterns showed what Sarah had learned to recognize as extreme political pressure. He was accompanied by someone new, a Zephyrian whose cranial ridges were so elaborate they looked almost architectural, and whose skin maintained a steady deep blue that her software identified as high authority. Commander Chen, this is Supreme Territorial Adjudicator Methkai, the highest-ranking legal authority in this sector of the collective voice. The complexity of your species' territorial situation has required involvement at the highest levels. Methkai spoke with harmonics so deep they were felt rather than heard. Human Chen, your species' territorial filing systems are unprecedented in their scope and complexity. Before we proceed with formal negotiations, I must ask, did your government deliberately structure these claims to create administrative complications for potential conquerors? Sarah considered her answer carefully. Supreme Adjudicator, human territorial law developed over centuries of exploration and colonization. We tend to be very thorough in documenting our claims to avoid conflicts with other human settlements. I don't think anyone anticipated that the system would be evaluated under collective voice law. Methkai's patterns shifted to what might have been grudging respect. The complexity is impressive, if inadvertent. However, it creates an untenable situation. The collective voice cannot maintain administrative oversight for such an extensive territorial network. What kind of solution are you considering? We are prepared to offer alternative territorial compensation. Rather than attempting to evaluate and assume administration of your 43 reserve worlds, we propose to grant your species permanent territorial rights to a limited number of worlds that better suit our administrative capabilities. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was it, the opening she'd been hoping for. What kind of territorial compensation are we discussing? We would be willing to grant permanent human territorial rights to 3 worlds of your choosing from our catalog of available territorial assignments. In exchange, you would formally relinquish all reserve world claims that cannot be efficiently administered under collective voice protocols. 3 worlds. That's a significant reduction from 43. What would make these 3 worlds preferable to the reserve system? Methkai's patterns suggested confident negotiation. These would be full territorial grants with complete administrative autonomy rather than custodial reserves with administrative oversight. Your species would have complete control over settlement, development, and governance. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That does sound preferable to the reserve system. What worlds are available for this kind of arrangement? We have prepared a catalog of 17 suitable worlds for your review. Most are terrestrial with appropriate atmospheric conditions for your species. Kethvar stepped forward, his patterns showing what Sarah had learned to recognize as nervous energy. The catalog includes detailed environmental assessments, mineral surveys, and habitability analyses. Including the ocean world that's causing the administrative problems? The silence that followed was so profound that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Finally, Methkai spoke. The ocean world presents unique administrative challenges. Our aquatic ecosystem specialists have determined that proper evaluation would require establishing specialized facilities and training programs that could take decades to implement. It would be efficient to include it among the compensation worlds rather than attempt administrative assumption. Sarah stared at the Supreme Territorial Adjudicator, hardly believing what she was hearing. Not only were the Zephyrians willing to give humanity 3 worlds instead of conquering them, but they were actively trying to give away the ocean planet because it was too much trouble to administer. I would need to review the full catalog before making any decisions, of course. Naturally. However, I must stress that this offer requires immediate consideration. The collective voice cannot maintain this territorial situation indefinitely. Of course. How long do I have to review the options? The territorial negotiation protocols allow for 72 hours of evaluation time. Sarah nodded seriously. I'll need to analyze each option carefully to make the best decision for humanity's future. As the Zephyrians left her quarters, Sarah sat back in her chair and began to laugh. She'd come here to surrender Earth and somehow ended up being offered 3 planets, including one that was perfect for human colonization. The hardest part would be explaining to Admiral Morrison how humanity had managed to turn military defeat into territorial expansion through nothing more than bureaucratic incompetence and alien legal complexity. But first, she had 72 hours to figure out exactly how to make this work. Sarah spent the first day of her 72-hour review period doing exactly what she'd promised, carefully analyzing each of the 17 worlds offered in the Territorial Compensation Catalog. What she discovered made her wonder if the universe had developed a sense of humor. The catalog was clearly designed to offer humanity marginal worlds that the Zephyrians considered administratively burdensome. There was a desert world with valuable mineral deposits but extreme weather conditions, a heavily forested planet with rich biodiversity but dangerous wildlife, several worlds with unusual atmospheric compositions that would require technological adaptation. And then there was Kepler 438b, the ocean world that had started this entire bureaucratic nightmare. According to the Zephyrian assessment, the planet was covered by a global ocean averaging 3 kilometers deep, with scattered volcanic islands and abundant marine life. The atmosphere was perfectly breathable for humans, the gravity was slightly higher than Earth normal, but well within acceptable parameters, and the climate was temperate across most of the globe. It was, quite literally, the perfect world for humanity to rebuild their civilization. And the Zephyrians were so eager to avoid the administrative complexity of managing an ocean world that they'd probably throw in free transportation just to get it off their territorial ledger. But Sarah had learned enough about Zephyrian legal culture to know that appearing too eager would raise suspicions. Instead, she spent her second day composing a list of detailed questions about each world, with particular attention to the administrative challenges that were making the Zephyrians so eager to give them away. On the morning of her final day, she requested a meeting with the full territorial evaluation team. When they arrived, she noticed that the group had grown to include several new Zephyrians whose skin patterns indicated specialized expertise and considerable anxiety. "Supreme Adjudicator," Sarah began, "I've completed my analysis of the territorial compensation options. I have several questions about the administrative arrangements." Methkai's patterns showed cautious optimism. "Please proceed with your inquiries." "First, regarding territorial autonomy. You mentioned complete administrative control over settlement and governance. Does that include the right to establish our own legal systems and environmental policies?" "Complete autonomy includes all governmental functions. The collective voice would have no administrative oversight responsibilities." "What about defense? If these worlds become human territory, what happens if they're threatened by external forces?" "Autonomous territorial grants include the right to self-defense and the establishment of military forces. The collective voice would not provide military protection, but would also not restrict your defensive capabilities." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And territorial development? We'd be free to modify the environment, establish settlements, exploit mineral resources, that sort of thing?" "Complete development rights are included in autonomous territorial grants." "Excellent. Now, I need to discuss some specific challenges with individual worlds." Sarah consulted her datapad. "The ocean world presents some unique questions. The entire group's skin patterns shifted to variations of nervous anticipation." "What kind of questions?" Vethnal asked. "Well, developing an ocean world obviously requires specialized technology and expertise. Floating cities, underwater habitats, marine agriculture systems. It's a significant undertaking. I'm concerned about whether humanity has the technological capability to properly develop such a world." The relief from the Zephyrian team was so palpable that Sarah almost laughed. "Human Chen," Methkai said, "the territorial compensation arrangement includes full development rights regardless of technological challenges. If your species chooses to accept the ocean world, it would be yours to develop according to your capabilities and timeline." "I see. And what if we're not able to develop it effectively? Would territorial rights revert to the collective voice?" "Absolutely not," Vethnal interjected quickly. "Autonomous territorial grants are permanent. The receiving species maintains full rights regardless of development success or failure." "That's very generous. What about the other species in the region? Would we need to coordinate with neighboring civilizations?" "The ocean world is located in a relatively isolated system," Methkai explained. "The nearest inhabited systems are controlled by the collective voice and would respect your territorial boundaries." Sarah pretended to consider this information carefully. "Supreme Adjudicator, I think I need to understand the broader strategic situation. Why is the collective voice willing to make such generous territorial compensation? From a human perspective, this arrangement seems almost too good to be true." Methkai's skin patterns shifted to what her software identified as complete honesty, tinged with desperation. "Human Chen, your species' territorial filing system has created an administrative crisis for the collective voice. Attempting to properly evaluate and administer 43 reserve worlds would require resources and expertise that we simply do not possess. The ocean world alone would require us to develop entirely new administrative protocols and specialist training programs." So you're offering us territorial compensation to avoid administrative burden? Precisely. The three-world territorial grant would resolve our administrative problems while providing your species with valuable territorial assets. It is an efficient solution for both parties. Sarah nodded slowly, as if still processing the implications. I think I understand the situation now. Let me ask you this. If we accept this arrangement, what happens to Earth and the other inhabited human territories? Earth and all inhabited human systems would become collective voice territories under standard occupation protocols. However, we would be willing to establish generous relocation assistance programs to help humans who wish to emigrate to your new autonomous territories. Relocation assistance? Transportation? Basic settlement supplies? Administrative support for the transition? We want to ensure that the territorial transfer proceeds smoothly. Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral. The Zephyrians were so eager to solve their administrative problem that they were offering to help humanity evacuate Earth and resettle on better worlds. It was the most generous conquest in galactic history. Supreme Adjudicator, I believe I'm ready to make my decision. The entire room went silent, skin patterns freezing in anticipation. I accept the territorial compensation arrangement. On behalf of humanity, I choose 3 worlds for permanent autonomous territorial status. Methkai's patterns showed intense relief mixed with anticipation. Which 3 worlds do you select? First, I choose designation AU-2847, the Heavy Forest World. The biodiversity will be valuable for scientific research, and the ecosystem will support human settlement with proper development. Excellent choice. The second world? Designation QX9923, the mineral-rich desert world. Despite the challenging climate, the resource potential will be crucial for human technological development. Very practical. And the third world? Sarah paused, as if still considering her options. For the third world, I choose designation KP438b, the Ocean World. The relief that flooded through the room was so intense that Sarah could practically feel it. Several of the Zephyrians' skin patterns shifted to colors her software identified as pure joy. Excellent choices, Methkai said, his patterns now showing confident satisfaction. These selections will resolve all administrative complications while providing your species with diverse territorial assets. There is one additional matter I'd like to discuss, Sarah said. The relocation assistance programs you mentioned. Of course. What specific assistance does your species require? Given the complexity of relocating an entire civilization, I think we'll need extensive transportation support. Fleet capability to move not just people but also infrastructure, manufacturing equipment, cultural artifacts, that sort of thing. The collective voice can provide significant transportation resources. And what about the transition timeline? How long do we have to complete the relocation? Methkai's patterns showed generous magnanimity. Given the scope of the relocation, we propose a transition period of 25 years. This should allow for orderly evacuation and settlement establishment. 25 years to evacuate Earth completely? Or to transition to a tributary status if some humans prefer to remain under collective voice administration? Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's very reasonable. I think humanity will be very pleased with this arrangement. Then we have an agreement. The formal territorial transfer ceremony will take place tomorrow, followed by immediate implementation of the relocation assistance programs. As the Zephyrian team filed out of her quarters, Sarah noticed that their skin patterns now showed celebration colors. They were genuinely happy to have solved their administrative crisis, even though they'd just given away 3 planets to do it. Sarah activated her communication system and sent an encrypted message to Admiral Morrison. The contents were brief. Mission accomplished. Surrender negotiations successful. Humanity has acquired 3 autonomous worlds, including 1 perfect for long-term settlement. full territorial sovereignty with 25-year transition period and transportation assistance. Recommend immediate preparation for voluntary evacuation and colonial expedition planning. Details to follow. She paused, then added, Suggest establishing Department of Interspecies Legal Affairs. Apparently we have a talent for this. The formal ceremony took place the next day in the largest chamber of the Zephyrian flagship. Sarah stood before the assembled collective voice representatives, reading from a prepared script that formally transferred Earth and all inhabited human territories to Zephyrian control, while simultaneously accepting autonomous territorial rights to 3 uninhabited worlds. The ceremony concluded with Methkai presenting Sarah with what appeared to be a crystalline data storage device containing the complete legal documentation of humanity's new territorial rights. "Commander Chen," Methkai said, his patterns showing formal respect, "your species has proven to be remarkably sophisticated in territorial negotiation. The collective voice acknowledges humanity as an autonomous territorial civilization with full sovereign rights to your granted worlds." Sarah accepted the crystal with appropriate ceremony. "On behalf of humanity, I thank the collective voice for this generous resolution to a complex situation." As Sarah prepared to return to Earth, Kethvar approached her with patterns showing something that might have been admiration. "Human Chen, may I ask you a question?" "Of course. Did your species deliberately design your territorial filing system to create negotiation advantages?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Speaker Kethvar, humans have a saying, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by incompetence. Our territorial system wasn't designed to create advantages. It was just designed by bureaucrats who really liked filling out forms completely." Kethvar's skin shifted to colors that her software identified as amusement, mixed with respect. Perhaps the collective voice underestimated the strategic value of thorough bureaucracy. Perhaps. But I think both our species have learned something valuable from this experience. "What is that?" Sarah smiled as she headed toward her shuttle. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in the galaxy is really comprehensive paperwork. 3 months later, the first human colonial ships departed for the ocean world that would become known as New Earth. The planet that the Zephyrians had been so eager to give away turned out to have marine ecosystems perfect for human adaptation, mineral resources that exceeded anything humanity had ever imagined, and enough space for their entire civilization to rebuild and expand. Admiral Morrison would later write in his memoirs that humanity's greatest victory came not from military might or technological superiority, but from the one thing that every civilization in the galaxy apparently feared: competent administrative bureaucracy. Commander Sarah Chen became humanity's first ambassador to the Galactic Council, a position she accepted with the understanding that her primary qualification was an unusual talent for making bureaucratic complexity work in humanity's favor. And deep in the archives of the collective voice, territorial administrative protocols were quietly revised to include a new subsection titled Human-Level Documentation Assessment, which required mandatory legal review of any species whose territorial filings exceeded 75 pages. No one wanted to go through that again.